Howdy ho, folks. I've been wanting to do a series like this for quite some time. It took me a while to kind of lay out the blueprint. I do have a pretty tight little script here, so maybe it'll go on for 20 minutes, maybe 40 minutes. Might just go off script and just ramble on for as long as they'll let me record. But as a guy who has made most of his money throughout his career as a reporter and had a couple of dalliances with marketing and PR and just generally being a writer, it's kind of been my job and occupation to basically manipulate public opinion. That's more or less how I've made money. And even if you look at journalism, supposedly an objective field, I mean, that's not really, what you're being paid for. You're not being paid to be a documentarian or a historian or someone just chronicling the times. Basically what happens is, and this is something that I can assure you happens anywhere there is a supposed news outfit. Basically, your editor comes to you and says, hey, we want to do something which benefits this third party. Write this so that it makes them look good or makes them they don't like look bad. And that's been the case every single place I worked. Journalism is not objective. It's all pay to play. And I think, as someone who actually is a reporter, and I admit in the past I have sold my soul for, $12 an hour or $14 an hour, how much I wasn't making. That there very much is sort of a propaganda component to the news reporting field. And I'm going to look at my script real quick and see if I can follow it, but I'm probably not. But really, before we get into this particular story, which I think is a really great anchor point to kind of talk about a lot of things going wrong with the media as a whole, let's talk about what journalism is. Journalism, basically, is just you telling people what happened. That's it. There's no agenda. There's no attempt to make people feel emotions. It's just one person saying, okay, well, something happened. Here's why they said this. And there's no attempt to give it sort of a deeper, more profound meaning. Journalism is, okay, on October 28th, this dude got shot by another dude at the intersection of 18th Street and 23rd Street. Cops said it was an armed robbery. I mean, that's it. That's journalism. You just tell people what happened. Where journalism goes wrong, and you see this all the time, not just at, the clickbait stuff, but even stuff like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which is my local paper. You see this creeping in. Supposedly you're supposed to be objective. You're supposed to be telling people, what happened and not what to think, but you keep seeing this slow creep of editorialization infecting what's supposed to be legitimate news coverage. So if journalism tells you what happened, editorials are lone individuals telling you what they think about certain things. So really, right off the bat, they're two diametric opposites. One thing is just giving you a factual statement of something that happened, whereas the other is someone actively trying to influence you and get you to think a certain way. So they can't merge. It's logically impossible. It's oil and water. But we're seeing the news industry, especially since the 2016 election, just become headlong, where they've just given up being objective. And what happens when you combine journalism with editorialism and they smack headlong into one fusion? Well, there's a term for that. It's called propaganda. And if journalism tells you what happened and editorials tell you how individuals feel, propaganda is something that doesn't tell you what happened. It tells you how you ought to think and then commands you to take a certain action. And it's one of those things where you're seeing it, and this is a perfect example. We'll get into this. We're going to dissect this and deconstruct this like it's a top-level college course. You should get college credit for this video. That's how thorough I'm going to debunk this and tear it apart. But that's the thing. That's the problem we got to deal with, because media, that's where you get your information. That's what sort of dictates and influences our interpretation of reality. And we're having people come along and willingly distorting it to fit their own end game, and thus giving us all a really, really bad look into the world that's inaccurate, just so they can, further their narrative or their agenda or whatever. And one of the really, really dangerous things about it, and the fact this is about religion, I think only helps the argument a little bit more, is that when you're looking at this new wave propaganda in the media, there's always some sort of underlying moral driving it, to where, almost like it has a pseudo-religious underpinning, where you're seeing language cloaked in, this metaphysical and unscientific and wholly objective terms like wrong, evil, and my personal favorite, descript vague term, immoral. You're seeing this pop up in news stories all the time as if they're actual, scientific, quantifiable, gaugeable things, when really they're all totally subjective, their opinion. But they're creeping up in stories all the time that are supposedly factual, and that's point blank proof that, number one, the people writing it aren't objective, and number two, the media and journalism as a whole has just become completely saturated by propagandists. And we saw this stuff happen in the news industry during the Red Scare. We saw it on the war on drugs, and now we're witnessing a new form of self-righteous hysteria in the media coming in the form of an entirely new cultural causa sui, and it's something called race relations. And we're going to get into that, the nuts and bolts of that. This might take an hour. This might take 2 hours. I don't know. But that's the new thing. That's the new hot topic. That's the thing the media is just drumming up and trying to get an agenda across. And there's a lot of manipulation, a lot of flat-out disinformation in the media, trying to stir up a certain agenda, getting people to think a certain way or believe a certain towel, and basically using their platform to push their own socio-political narrative and agendas instead of actually being a documentary of the times or just being a historical track record. That's bad. Alright, so I'm going to get some coffee real quick. Got a sore throat. This is very casual, by the way. I'm teaching this like this is actually an accredited 90-minute college class, so we'll take our time. Alright, so before we get into this, a little bit of background information, because before you actually read a news story, it's always a good idea to do a little bit of background information and find out a little bit of details about the publication, about not only the people who wrote it, but especially the people who paid that person to write it. What is their bread and butter? What are their financial interests? So we'll go to that real quick. Alright, so the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and I'm just picking on them because they're available. I live in Atlanta, this is the newspaper I get. And what you need to know is they're owned by a corporation called Cox Enterprises. And over there you'll see the Wikipedia information. They're rich, very, very rich. They make about $18 billion a year. They're a multimedia conglomerate. They actually have more revenue, as you'll see at the bottom, than the National Football League. So this is a hugely, massive and rich and wealthy and just monolithic sort of enterprise. So it's not a mom and pop. So obviously these guys are a huge billion-dollar corporation. And if you're a billion-dollar corporation, then one of your top priorities is what? Holding on to your billions of dollars. So keep that in mind. That's a very important thing we need to look at in determining, what sort of things would behoove them. What would keep money in their coffers? Who are they trying to appeal to? And really, one of the particularly interesting things about Cox Enterprises, and we're seeing this from a lot of media publishers, they're conglomerates. You have organizations and businesses which don't really normally dabble in the media, suddenly, all of a sudden, getting into media. We saw it with the Koch brothers buying a couple of newspapers. I was trying to influence public opinion. Berkshire Hathaway, another huge billion-dollar conglomerate, and for whatever reason, a lot of their holdings are actually in real estate traditionally. So you have people who are dabbling in real estate all of a sudden getting into media ventures, and you have guys like the Koch brothers, or Koch brothers, however you want to pronounce their name, who are doing like food and like mass food production getting into media. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Until you remember, oh yeah, because the media is of course a public persuasion tool, and if we use this instrument, we can use it to, behoove our own interests, or at least play damage control to people who might want to, slide us. And Cox Enterprises, obviously, they are no different than everybody else. Their bread and butter actually is automotive stuff. They actually publish Auto Trader. They do a lot of dealings with auto trading, not just the publication, but I actually think actual car dealership and things like that. So that's their business. They're making a lot of money through selling cars, but also involved in media. They have a TV station in Atlanta. Obviously, they have the AJC. So we gotta kind of figure this out. What's the point? If you're doing this thing where you're primarily making money through automotive sales, and this is a little bit different. I mean, Cox, they have historically kind of been involved in the media, which is something you can't say about Berkshire Hathaway and Koch and all these other groups. But even then, there's something kind of interesting there. It's almost like you're kind of using one platform to benefit the other, which, of course, is at the heart of modern media and is pretty much the driving force of the propaganda we see. Now, this is interesting because not only do you need to know who are the people paying people to write stories, but you need to know about the people who are at the hierarchy of the organization publishing, these giant, monolithic publications. And for the Cox industry, one of the richest women in the world is named Anne Cox Chambers. And she's like the big heiress to the Cox Enterprise fortune. And her son, I believe, started the Cox Media Group, which grew into $1 billion monolithic enterprise. And he had a son, also named James Cox, interestingly enough. And he's an interesting figure because lately, very, very recently, this is actually a national story. And this, I think, is emblematic because if this are the politics he holds dear, then I don't think it's really a stretch to say that maybe everybody else in his family and by proxy the content of their publications would skew the same way. So yeah, you may have recalled a news story about a gym in Atlanta banning cops and military members. Well, that's kind of interesting. There's a big story here in Atlanta, but I noticed something very odd. They never brought up a very peculiar, interesting fact in the local media. And that, of course, being that the guy who banned the military and the police at the gym, that's the grandson of Anne Cox Chambers. He's actually the son of the guy who started the Cox Media Group. It started this whole giant monolithic thing. So, yeah, that's his ideology. That's the ideology. Now, granted, he's not, physically involved in the day-to-day operations, but we all know our politics, basically, they're just run off from our parents, right? So I'm going to have to assume that if this guy is this hyper-liberal, like this bomb-throwing, progressively liberal, to where he has absolute vehement hatred of, the cops and the military, call me cynical, call me a little bit skeptical, but maybe, just maybe, he kind of learned that from his parents and his family. That maybe that sort of, permeated his own cultural upbringing, and maybe this is a view that, if not necessarily shared, is at least tolerated, embraced, and mildly propagated by the people who run this billion-dollar media company. So there's that. And also, another thing about the AJC, or Cox Enterprises, look at their holdings. Manheim, Kelly Blue Book, that's what's talking about the big automotive dealings, where they get a lot of their money. And Valpak. What is Valpak? Coupon distribution. It's a weird thing. I mean, without coupons, I'm not really sure we'd even have like a modern newspaper industry. That's kind of the one thing propping, the dying model up. But there's something interesting to think about. That, you have all these auxiliary, subsidiary interests, corporate business interests, that are propping up, that are really behind every story you read about, positive, negative. It all goes back to feeding the corporate coffers. And that's really sort of a liberal and conservative sort of mindset, isn't it? We're both against that. And oh, by the way, this Chambers guy who banned the police and military, part of this huge influential media family, also got arrested for, domestic violence. So throw that one out there. Just saying. Nobody in Atlanta media talked about that. Why? Because, of course, I won't give it a black eye. He's family. He's royalty in the media. They're going to talk about that. So a lot of times the silence around certain things, a lot of times it's what the media doesn't say, which is the most important telling thing. And you'll be seeing exactly what I'm talking about there in just a few moments. All right. So moving along. To this particular story about race relations in the AJC. It's this ongoing series. I haven't looked at too many other chapters, but basically the idea, anyone that does a series, if you're in the field of journalism like I am, you've ever been in a newsroom, they do this all the time. They do awards bait. And the AJC is no different. Last year, they haven't won a big national award in a long time. So they did this story about doctors and sex abuse. I think that's what they called it because they're not really good with titles. And it was like this long feature story, and it wasn't even really focused about Atlanta. It was like talking about people in New Hampshire and, these isolated stories of doctors, molesting and raping patients and trying to kind of propagate it like it's a huge, gigantic medical issue, despite the fact the numbers probably don't, confirm that. Even got a hashtag up there, so that doctor sex abuse. So obviously they want this to become like a huge national story and win a whole bunch of Pulitzers, and they didn't. And I think that failure to win the awards bait is probably the explanation for this whole race relations article, because they're not doing it really to sort of, well, I mean, they are doing it, I guess, to sway public opinion, but at the heart of it, they're not doing it as a public service. They're doing it because they want, the Pulitzer community to say, hey, that's a really great forward-thinking, progressive, innovative series you're doing. Here, have some awards, and of course they can use that to, add artificial prestige and pump up their own egos. And I think that's a huge thing about the media industry. A lot of times, if the financial incentive isn't the reason for why things the way they are, it's ego. Because trust me, reporters, journalists, publishers, they're kind of narcissistic. I've been around a whole bunch of them, and they all have pretty much the same attitude. They want social status because they're definitely not making money doing this. And since the whole doctor sex abuse thing wasn't, controversial enough, it didn't really have that resonance, then it only makes sense that you go towards, well, what else? What's probably the most controversial topic, the most hot button issue in the U.S. today? Racial conflict. The simple fact they're using the word racial comedy, not comedy, committee, I gotta keep stressing that, and racial conflict on the first page, I think should kind of give you a good idea of where journalism is going wrong. Because here's the thing. Basic rules of objectivity. Journalists, you're not supposed to put statements of opinion in news stories. Because racial comedy and racial conflict, now is it racial comedy or racial committee? Because both words sound like other words and neither one sounds right, but let's throw it in there. Because racial committee and racial conflict are, to this day, among the most urgent challenges we face. And this is sort of the setup for the story to why you should think it's important. Why is this problematic? Because this isn't a statement of fact, this is an opinion. Point is day. Saying that racial conflict today is one of the most urgent challenges we face. Well, I mean, according to who? I mean, that's not a consensus opinion. I mean, if everybody in the U.S., had a huge, poll and said, yeah, that is a big urgent challenge we face, then maybe you take a grain of salt. But they didn't do that. This is one reporter or one publication saying, we think this is a pressing issue and you should too. So they're trying to engineer the way you feel and think about a certain subject, which right off the bat is brass-balled, like completely unrepentant propaganda. Right from the get-go, I can tell you, this is not intended to be a news story. This is flat out just social activism. And it gets worse in the follow-up statement. Why now? Because these two churches have shown progress doesn't happen without effort. And once again, that's number one, it's not a factual statement, it's objective. And second, how do you define progress? How do you define effort? I mean, like, what are you trying to say? That's not a clear, concise statement. Journalism, you're supposed to be very concise. It should not be opaque. There's no mystery to it. Your sentence tells you exactly what you need to know. This one, even like as like a lead-in to like build up suspense for the rest of the story, I mean, it's just so vague. And there's nothing about this statement that is factual. It's all opinion, and even the terms they use aren't even defined. So they're kind of using leading words to where these words have a certain, social connotation, and they're kind of hoping that you'll fall into that you'll use that as your definition, and therefore they can just keep manipulating and massaging I said massaging, not assuaging, in case you're wondering, the idea, and kind of lead you to see things their way and why their opinion, not factual reporting, is the correct way to do things. Propaganda. Propaganda. So a little bit more about the story. I got to check my notes here. Let's see real quick. There's something fairly important I want to say about this one. But going back to that last slide, I mean, if you're going to say it's an urgent, pressing matter, I mean, you got to at least give us some sort of statement that backs that up. I mean, what makes, racial relations a bigger social problem than unemployment or crime or child abuse? The author doesn't tell us. So even as like an editorial, it fails on that basic level. They don't do a good job, not only of importing actual factual information, but even advocating for their own cause. So it sucks as journalism, and it sucks as an editorial. You don't get that too often. So hooray, whoever wrote this. All right. So yeah, moving along. Let's just take a very, very, very quick gander at, well, I guess it kind of speaks for itself. The premise of this story is, it's called Humanity and Humility. This reporter got a bunch of people from Roswell, and Roswell is it's an interesting part. I actually worked there for quite a while, so I can tell you where all the skeletons are buried. But basically, if you have Atlanta down here, Atlanta, is the big, economic nexus. To the south of that, you've got South Fulton, which is basically predominantly black, predominantly lower class. And then above Atlanta, you have North Fulton, and that's predominantly white and Asian and really, really stinking ridiculously rich. So if you want to do a story about race relations, you can do them. I mean, you can do stories about affordable housing and, the local governments, banning homeless people. I mean, you could do really, really good factual-driven stories which touch upon huge racially divisive social issues. This story is not that. This story is literally a bunch of people from different churches going to like this one guy's house on a Sunday afternoon and talking about, Ferguson and Trayvon Martin. How is that newsworthy? I mean, this is like day one journalism stuff, right? You go in there, you're in your introductory course about what journalism is. One of the first things you gotta ask yourself, after the who, what, when, where, and why, okay, what makes something newsworthy? I mean, how do you decide what's the most important thing to talk about? And that in and of itself, I think, is a huge, vessel to kind of show the, pervasive propaganda usage of the media and how biased a lot of these publications are. How does this affect anybody? I mean, if you're covering Atlanta, the metropolitan Atlanta area is like 6 million people, and you're doing a story about, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people sitting on a potluck dinner one afternoon talking about events that happened 4 years ago, that's more newsworthy. That's worthy of an 8-page spread more than stories about, the city's crumbling infrastructure or rampant child abuse, or the rampant failure of the social entitlement programs, about, DFACs not delivering services, about the drug trade, about, all these really, really horrible things that are affecting not just thousands, but millions of people in the Atlanta area. They totally forego that, and they want you to think this story in particular is actually not only newsworthy, but perhaps the most important thing going on socially in a region of 6 million people. And if you believe that, I've got a bridge in London I want to sell you. So right from the get-go, if you just use your analytical mind, if you just pare things back down, you strip away the politics, and you just look at things from a very hyperlogical level, usually you can weed out the propaganda early. In this case, it's really, really on the nose, and unfortunately it gets worse from here. Alright, and here you'll see another example of obvious subjective opinion creeping into a factual news story, which somehow the editors didn't pick up. Just it's underlined there, I'll read it out for you. Early this year, the two congregations broke into small groups to try to talk about the nation's ugly racial history and their own biases with something approaching candor. Anything more than that would be really not important what the next line is. But right there, the nation's ugly racial history. Folks, that's opinion. That's not a factual statement. That's one person's opinion on, well, a really large topic that's naturally subjective. So right off the bat, and this is one of the foundational paragraphs to kind of give you an outline of what the entire story is about, and right off the bat, it's based on assuming a certain position and driving home a particular agenda to reinforce what the author's opinion is. So, not news. Long story short, that's basically what you need to get out of that. Alright, so if you move along here, and this is, I don't know, this one's just a really interesting thing about just really the whole media industry as a whole. So there's a statement here where one of the people involved in this roundtable discussion uses the N-word, and we actually have like this completely like self-important, self-inflated like editor's notes about the publication using the dreaded N-word. So they're saying that an exception is being made for the story given its objective Wait, hold on. Wait, hold on. News stories should not have an objective. I mean, that's it. The only objective you have is to tell what happened factually. And they follow it up with probably one of the most amazing lines of BS I've read in quite some time. So they're saying the objective of this story is to chronicle an honest, uncensored conversation about race. That's the whole point you did this. That's why you dedicated 8 pages of your Sunday news edition for that reason. Well, no, it's because the publication has a certain opinion on race relations, which behoove its own political agenda, which benefits its own corporate standing. Therefore, we're going to just keep giving you this story and projecting out these people's opinion as if they're representative of the entire metropolitan area, and deal with it. So, yeah, if you want to talk about something to be offended by, the fact that they're insulting our intelligence that bad by claiming that it's objective, and it has an objective which is the diametric opposite. It's not being honest or uncensored. It's clearly, pointed towards a particular outcome to get you to think a certain way. Yeah, that's pretty offensive to me. That is, again, that's just some brass ball propaganda. And once again, it's not, hidden. It's not like a PSYOPs campaign. Everybody has the wrong idea of what propaganda is. Like, it's engineered. Like, there's a bunch of guys trying to, put subliminal messages. No, it's just out in the open. It's publications not even adhering to the standards of objectivity. And it's stuff like this where they come out and say, well, I think my emotions, my thoughts on a certain subject are so important that we should break the laws of journalism and just go out there and push it forward that my totally subjective opinion is truth, and you should accept it. And that, folks, is very, very, very dangerous. And now we're going to come to something which, boy, this one is huge editorial oversight. So there's a statement where the pastor, and I believe he's African American, talking to some white guys, and he has this passage that says their ignorance about racial and social justice, and there's 2 loaded terms there, one racial justice and social justice, their lack of experience with authentic cross-racial relationships, their lack of compassion for black victims of police violence, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, Alvin Sterling, Eric Garner. It was as if they were roadkill, Jenkins said. I was just discouraged. Okay, now right then and there, if I were the editor of this newspaper, this person who wrote this would get a stern talking to, because there's nothing in front of it, there's nothing ahead of it, there's no apostrophe, there's nothing saying, by the way, what this guy is saying, not only is it his opinion, it's not really 100% factual either. And look at that term right there. And that's crazy to me. This happened in a major, top 10 market newspaper. That there's a guy saying that these black victims of police violence, and again, it's his own quote, it's his opinion, but here's the thing. The information contained within the brackets, that's not factual. What he's saying is not truthful, and to be frank, the AJC really screwed the pooch by not pointing that out. That there is some major problems with this guy's narrative, and he basically said an infactual thing and passed it off as if it was factual, and they didn't. And here's what I mean by that. Just a quick rundown, because the guy comes out and says this. Here's, some things that the AJC doesn't bring up that you might want to take into consideration about this whole narrative of black victims of police violence. Yeah, the whole Michael Brown thing, the cop did not violate his rights. That was found by a trial jury. So the idea of him being a black victim of police violence, the fact that he's not sitting in jail and that no jury convicted him of it, that's kind of an infactual statement, guy. And George Zimmerman, yeah, George Zimmerman, the cop, remember, this guy, this Hispanic dude in Miami who shot Trayvon Martin? So yeah, that doesn't make George Zimmerman, he's not a police officer, therefore Trayvon Martin is not a victim of police violence. That's not even like within the same realm. That's a complete, huge, gigantic, massive, 5-star reporting error. That's the kind of thing where if it's a school newspaper and you report that, you would get an F. But because, the AJC is trying to push this particular agenda and win awards and kind of, assemble and engineer public opinion, you can overlook little things like, fact. And another thing, talking about Tamir Rice, just something to kind of throw out there, because another thing I do to kind of cut your way through propaganda, look at real proprietary primary sources. Don't just take people's word for it. And this is interesting about the whole Tamir Rice thing. Okay, yeah, it was a tragedy. 2017, I believe is when it happened. No, 2015, that was the year Tamir Rice was killed. There were 43 instances of cops, and this is from the Washington Post. They did a huge checklist of all the police-involved shootings for that year. There were 43 involving toy weapons, and as you can see here, only 6 of them involved black people, and only 7 involved Hispanic, and 29 of them involved white people. So you had more whites with toy weapons being shot and killed by the cops than you did blacks and Hispanics combined. So why isn't that being pushed as a narrative? Why isn't that being used as a racial relation dynamic to move an agenda and frame your story around? Well, it doesn't, therefore no mention of it. Then going to Philando Castile, once again, violence of police brutality. Well, I mean, apparently not so much, because the dude was put on trial. And by the way, obviously, as you can tell there, this Yanez guy, Yanez, whatever, kind of not white. So that whole racial dynamic narrative, unless you're talking about Hispanic on black violence, which is a huge, huge deal, which is kind of underreported for mysterious reasons, that's not kind of gelling with the AJC's white-black dynamic. So that's another thing that's kind of overlooked. That's not a factual statement. Whether you think the guy did it for real or not, the fact of the matter is, in a court of law, he was found not guilty. Therefore, this whole narrative about him being a victim of black police violence, factually inaccurate. Sorry, that's the way it is. That's the rules of journalism. You got to be objective. If that's what the law says, that's what you got to print. Then, of course, you got stuff about Alton Sterling. Once again, I just kind of feel you got to give the background information, because they're positing one side of the story and forgetting a whole lot of other stuff. Once again, the guy said he's a victim of police violence. Well, no, not really, because the Department of Justice didn't file a charge against the officers that shot him. And furthermore, a lot of people don't know this, since Alton Sterling did have a gun on him, and he was a convicted felon who apparently had been arrested for raping a child, as you can see there, just by having a gun on him, he was committing a violent felony. So that whole narrative about, just some random guy getting roughed up by the cops goes out the window. He was actively committing a violent felony just by possessing a firearm on him. So that whole narrative, once again, kind of doesn't gel. Something's not checking out. Or at least the thing the media keeps telling us is not really being proven by historical documentation, or, those little trifling things about what the law actually says. And again, black victim police, that whole thing. Well, the cop involved in the chokehold death of Eric Garner, he was cleared. So once again, even though this guy said it, it's opinion, you can't accept it as a statement of fact. You just can't do it. That's journalistic malfeasance. That is intentionally obscuring the truth from your readers. And if you do that, well, you're not a journalist point blank. You're a manipulator. And maybe you shouldn't be in the business. But there's a lot of people out there like it. In fact, I want to say the majority of people in the journalist field are like that. So what can you do? Except be more literate of the media you consume. Be a little bit more critical. Take a look at the small things and be able to kind of distinguish, with their true objectives and true meanings and what they're really trying to get across in their backgrounds, which is the whole point of this video, naturally. Alright, and up next we have one of my favorite canards, and you see this a lot of times in not just BuzzFeed and Huffington Post, but, legitimate, allegedly legitimate news publications. So there's this part where this one guy is talking about white privilege. So I highlighted the really pertinent stuff here. He was like, sometimes we don't perceive, you as being caring because you're not walked in our shoes because of white privilege. And then the guy is like, when I hear white privilege, I'm having my world rocked. Because now he's realizing that white privilege, which, not even just in the context of the statement. I mean, it's the guy's opinion, but the fact that the paper itself is documenting it like it's a real thing, that, every white person in America is imbued with some sort of supernatural ability to succeed while, African Americans aren't. that there actually is documented proof of, societal bias in the socioeconomic system framework that we have here in the U.S., which automatically gives an advantage to white people over African Americans. That that idea is legitimate when there's no conclusive proof for it, and the fact that it's actually not news, it's actually a subjective, opinionated statement. And the fact that that goes throughout this story completely unchallenged and unquestioned is yet another sign that some tomfoolery is afoot. And speaking of white privilege, I just want to throw this out there because, one of the things I like to do about news, I don't like to take the reporter's word for it. If they're talking about somebody or they make a statement, I like to do a little bit of research myself because we got this thing called the Google. We have this thing that's even better. It's called the Internet Archive. You can actually look up information on people that's not on the web anymore, that for whatever reason just completely disappeared. And it's kind of funny that we're having a discussion about white privilege because the focal point of the story is this guy named Lee Jenkins. And Lee Jenkins is the black pastor in Roswell who kind of helped bring this whole story about. And you'll see how much of a stranglehold he had on this story come to fruition towards the end of the video. But yeah, he's talking about white privilege and socioeconomic bias and all that. But wait a minute, let's take a look at a statement that he used to have on his own website. Well, here's some more information about this Lee Jenkins guy. Yeah, apparently as a guy who has clearly benefit from white superiority and, white privilege, he only invested a multi-million-dollar firm and merged with Atlanta Capital Group and only managed, combined assets of $500 million. So, yeah, he's a guy that was a student at the World Trade Center training class. Let's see, worked for Morgan Stanley, won all these awards. My goodness, this Lee Jenkins guy does not seem to me like a victim of the oppressive state. I don't really think, white privilege stopped him from being successful. That, his skin color was necessarily a barrier for him to have a lot of really, really highfalutin success. And I'm going to assume that if this guy merged with Atlanta Capital Group and combined client assets of more than $500 million, I couldn't, find his personal income because, when you work for a church, you don't have to really disclose that much information. Not saying that should be a factor. Not saying that should be a story on its own. But I'm assuming that, if you're running a church and you have all these businesses and you're holding at least $500 million in capital at one point, managing that as a stockbroker, you're probably not poor. I know that's a huge assumption on my part that this guy is probably not making $14 an hour, that maybe he's actually a lot better off financially in terms of social stature than a lot of the white people he's decrying for their white privilege. I'm not saying that's hypocritical. I'm not saying that that's, untrue. I'm just saying it's an interesting thing to consider with his narrative that, that this guy has been cursed or blessed or imbued, I guess would be a better term for it, with white privilege, which allows him to succeed when I think it's probably a safe bet to say that of all the guys in the room for this story, including the reporter, Lee Jenkins is the richest. Now, I can't prove that because he doesn't disclose personal information, but maybe there's a reason why he's keeping that financial data on lockdown. So this guy, he definitely overcame white privilege. There's no doubt about that if he has that much money. So, yeah, just something to think about. That you have a guy who is literally wealthier than probably everybody in the room combined, criticizing people for their socioeconomic privilege. Like I said, make of that what you will. I just think it's an interesting thing that the newspaper and really the American media in whole just doesn't have the huevos to address. Alright, and a little bit later on in the story, there's a part where this other guy is talking about Castile and how he was portrayed in the media as a guy who might have had a marijuana arrest and they were immediately trying to criminalize him. And he said that had a transformation. That was when he realized the mainstream media had it out for black people and they're trying to push a narrative. And you make it seem like these guys are, the scum of the earth, when really there's innocent victims and, all that jazz. Alright, well, number one, I think the fact that, saying the mainstream media has it out for black people, just any objective look at the Huffington Post or CNN or MSNBC or any of the major news channels, they're not exactly, openly racist about things. In fact, you can actually say that by sheer proxy of stories like this, they're actually openly advocating for black people. That they're actually trying to, use their publication to make life easier or to help them overcome certain hardships. Which, I mean, is a noble cause, but not for a news publication. It's supposed to be objective. It's supposed to be a piece of social advocacy. You're not promoting activism. You're just telling stories. And of course, this neo civil rights jihad pushed by the media today clearly works social activism and not objective coverage. So this whole idea that saying the media, I mean, maybe outside of like the far right blogosphere has it out for black people and tries to stereotype them, I'm not personally seeing it. I have a hard time seeing that as a general applicable term for what most people call the mainstream media. But even with this statement, going with the whole Castile thing, the reporter never brings it up, nobody in the story ever mentions it, but circumstance of his death, well, I mean, the guy was, pulled over 31 times with 63 traffic charges. I mean, I'm just going to say that maybe that whole incident really didn't have anything to do with race as much as it had the fact that the guy was really, really baiting for a Darwin Award. I mean, if you have 63 traffic charges and you're found guilty of 43 of them, maybe you're not a very good listener. Maybe you don't really learn. Maybe, you don't really understand the dire circumstances of your life and your own actions. And maybe that sort of willful ignorance may have played just as big a factor in his demise as it did, perhaps this whole much more popular narrative that, the cops are racist and they all hate black people and they just want to shoot them because they're mean and evil. And all these other totally objective terms that have no substantial merit as journalistic publication terminology. Just want to throw that out there. Just saying, that could be a factor as well. A factor worth considering before you jump on this big jihad and publicly declare that cops are out there gunning down black people en masse like it's open season. And moving along here, this one, I wrote some notes down for this one, I'm trying to find them real quick. So this guy's talking about how we've all contributed to prejudice and biases. I think it's important for us to acknowledge that. I don't believe I got the truth from everybody at this table to say I didn't know or I didn't participate in a lie. We all participate because of a lot of pain. It's about relationships and exposure, but if we don't communicate and be real, then this was just a conversation. Well, I mean, that last sentence there I think is probably the most important thing with the entire story because that's it. It's just a conversation. That's all it is. Not only that, but it's like a media orchestrated conversation. It's not a legitimate, like, organic event. The newspaper colluded with the people involved in it to make it a media story. It's made for TV. It's made for print. This is not a quote-unquote real happening. The newspaper organized it. They put it together. It's not real coverage. I mean, I have a hard... That's the real root of propaganda we're trying to talk about here. It's not, like I said earlier, like psyops or them putting subliminal messages. It's the fact that they're going out there and they're completely just pre-manufacturing and engineering these stories, which are not organic, which are not real whatsoever. They're basically being assembled in-house with no regard for objective journalistic standards and passing along as newsworthy. That's kind of the meat of the matter. That's the whole point of me dissecting this. And nobody at the AJC picked up on it. Nobody at all. And that should tell you everything you need to know about journalism. So, in this whole statement here, like I said, it's a person's opinion, so I can't shout it too much, but just objectively, it's another call to blame, people for in-group prejudice just because of what they look like. Which, I don't know, this is going to sound crazy, but I think the idea of blaming people for things, specifically the actions of others based simply on the fact that they're the same color, that they share that common characteristic. Guys, I'm just going to say it, that's kind of racist. To say that just because, that a certain group did this, that a person who shares that same characteristic should apologize for it, or should shoulder the blame of things that happened 200 years ago, kind of dumb. I think that's kind of the problem, is because we're trying to sort of push this collectivist narrative. The entire, table, the stack of cards of, a modern-day identitarianism in America hinges on the fact that we believe in collectivist identity and not individual identity. And in fact, that's the entire reason this story exists, because if we lived in a society where we're focused on the individual and their personal actions and thoughts and not, their basic group characteristics, this story wouldn't happen. This story is not about individual people with individual thoughts, individual ways of looking at the world. It's people who are, white and black and talking about things that other white and black people do, and then just sort of taking that and basically projecting it on everybody else. That's what you're seeing in the news media writ large. That's what you're seeing in this story. And unfortunately, that's something that you're doing and seeing pretty much throughout all of American society at this dire, dire juncture in our history. And I really hope you kids are taking notes at home, because by me saying this dire, dire moment in our collective history, that's objective. I should get points off for that, so hopefully you're listening. So I have this statement here where this one white person says that our race has been a transgressor, our inaction, our silence on certain things, something we'll have to deal with. Most of us are guilty of a lack of empathy. Again, collectivist identity triumphing over individual identity, the fact that you should assume the responsibility for things that happened 200 years before you were born. That's just stupid. I mean, take responsibility for your own individual actions, but don't judge people for their in-group behavior. In fact, the idea of in-group behavior itself and in-group ideology, it's inherently racist. Instead of saying, because you're white or because you're black, you should take responsibility for the actions of all white and black people, how about you just take responsibility for the only action you control, which is your own? And unfortunately, if that was basically the prevailing social attitude, the news industry itself would probably collapse, because all of this is trying to get people, basically the readers, to say, okay, I don't want to look at people as individuals. I want to look at them as collectivist group members. I want to project this particular attitude about everyone I see. So in a strange way, for a story about racial reconciliation, if you read it and you go through the quotes and you sort of narrow it down to its bare essential elements, it's actually kind of promoting its readers to be more racist. Right? To not look at people as individuals and look at their individual merits, but to actually see more race in day-to-day affairs. Right? To just look at people as solely their race and to not, consider other factors like, character or intelligence or basic human decency. But to just project these long prevailing stereotypes on everybody. And that's kind of the terrible, terrible irony of the identity politicization of the news media. Instead of making things better, it's just making things way, way worse. Do not trust these people to make things better. Journalists, I can tell you this, there's a lot of things they are. The one thing they are not above all else, problem solvers. I mean, yeah, really, after all, if your entire career depends on documenting societal downfall and looking for anything to sort of exploit as sensationalistic and take advantage of, do you really want problems to go away, or you want them to get worse, you have something to cover, and you have job security? I'll let you be the judge of that one. And going back to this whole identity politics thing, this guy, the statement he made, saying that, white people are the transgressors, they should take responsibility for inaction. Well, I mean, let's apply that term, not retroactively, but just the current. I mean, what exactly are African Americans doing about a disproportionate rate of Latinos being human trafficked in the U.S.? I mean, there's slavery going on today. I don't really see a whole lot of black people taking blame for that, for their inaction. Or white people, for that matter. I mean, how come we're not, harping on each other for not doing anything about that when we clearly could? Or even better, there's 18 million people in India right now living in slavery. That's more than the entire Atlantic slave trade. White people aren't saying anything. Black people aren't saying anything. Hispanic people aren't saying anything. No one feels collective guilt about this. Even though we can all say something about it, it's happening right now. But no one has that same sheer guilt as we do over the black-white racial dynamic in the U.S. Peculiar, I know. And I mean, why not? You don't really see a whole lot of, black or Hispanic or Asian identitarians talking about the sea of despair among white working-class Americans. If you don't know about this one, it's the fact that guy's Angus Deaton right there, a Pulitzer Prize, or Nobel Prize winning, economist, who's been studying the rapid increase in the mortality rate of middle-aged non-college educated white people throughout middle America. If you don't know about that, basically what's happening is, if you live in middle America, if you live in Appalachia, if you're a white male between the age of I think it's 34 to 50, you are now dying off at a disproportionate rate higher than the death rate for young men at the absolute height of the HIV crisis. So this is a absolutely huge social phenomenon going on. A lot of innocent people dying, huge, probably the biggest social pathology, weird freakonomics, human issue going on in America right now. Nobody's talking about it, and nobody who isn't white, or even white people themselves, are taking the blame for it. No one's saying, boy, our inaction right now is costing a lot of people dying that don't need to die, that could be getting help. Nobody's saying that. Nobody's saying, well, we're being active transgressors by not caring about this issue. Nobody's doing that. Why? Because, well, I'll just be very cynical about it, because I don't think it sells. I think the black-white dynamic, that whole racial animosity, if you exploit that, people will pay for it. They'll read it. It stirs their emotions, not their logic, not their thinking. This is too objective. It's not trying to, advocate for people to do a certain thing. It's not stoking any sort of racial animosity. It's not being sensational. But then again, stirring the whole black-white race war dynamic. That's a great way to get more clicks, as hopefully the AJC has figured out. Oh, another thing about that, I just want to throw this out there, because this is the big one. I mean, if we're doing this whole transgressor thing, we should all feel guilty for not, doing enough. A lot of poor white people. 95% of the poorest counties in America, predominantly white. You look up on Wikipedia. And I know I'm using the Daily Caller here, and that is a right-wing site, but look at the source I've used. I used the Washington Post to screen before that, and that's as liberal as it gets. So don't harp on me for that. If I'm going to use one form of propaganda, I'm free to use other form of propaganda, and you can't call me out on it. Just saying. Alright, so we're going to wrap this up real quick. Here's a reporter, Rosalind Bentley, and here's the thing. She's nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, won a couple of awards. And I want you to read this part about how we got the story, because this tells you everything you need to know about propaganda in modern media. So, this first instance here, and we're going to show you a little bit of back history here, that last year, is 2016 I believe, 2015, one of those years, there was a cop in the Roswell area who had been on the force for 20-something years. She had a rebel flag outside her house. The Jenkins guy who we talked about earlier found out about it, and basically got her fired. So that kind of shows you just how much white privilege we have in the U.S. today. That, you can get fired despite having 20 years of good service just because people don't like an emblem you have on you. That can be the sole reason you get out. White privilege didn't really protect her that much. So yeah, basically, after this pastor dude, he came up with an idea, this kind of social media crusade to get this cop fired because he didn't like the rebel flag. He reached out to the reporter of this story, and basically he sort of tied that wholly unrelated incident with the whole thing about the not quite epidemic, or at least the media's claims there's an epidemic of, police violence against black men. He merged those two together, and they're completely separate subjects. And basically what he did was he reached out to her to do the story. This is not the reporter, this Bentley person, going to the church and saying, I want to do a story about you. It says it clear as day, almost like, when you read a study and it's talking about the limitation then that tells you everything is BS. It tells you clear as day. The preacher came up with the idea for the story. This is not a real organic news story. This is basically the guy coming out and saying, I want to use your publication and your platform to promote my own agenda, my own perspective. And they come out and say it right there. It's crazy that no one picked up on this. Are the editors of the AJC so insanely biased about this issue that they circumvent clear and obvious just conflicts of interest within their own feature stories? I'm just absolutely floored by that. But moving along, of course, not really a surprise here. You look at Rosalind Bentley's Twitter profile. Yeah, I mean, pretty much what you expect. Obvious bias here. obviously trying to promote a particular agenda. I think these Twitter comments pretty much speak for herself, that she's not really objective, that she's not really all that open-minded about the subject of contemporary race relation issues in the U.S. So I'll let you read that on your own time. I think they speak for themselves. And just going back to it, gotta go to my notes real quick. I don't know. I just think we're living in the era of the fetishization of guilt and race masochism, where everybody just feel bad about who they are. And I don't really see what's so healthy about that. What good does that do? And that, in a nutshell, it kind of explains to you today why being critical and somewhat cynical about what the media says is more important than ever. We always hear, that old saying about who watches the Watchmen, right? That we need the journalists around and the media and the mass, publishing empire, the monoliths they are around, to be the fourth estate, to keep an eye on the powerful. But here's the problem. They don't ever apply that same logic to themselves. It is basically people whose jobs it is to frame and basically go out there and propagate mass social ideology. There's nobody watching them. They don't have any restraints. There's no one saying, okay, you're really being biased, this is untrue, you're trying to promote agenda, this isn't journalism, this is activism. And I think it's important for each and every one of us to be more critical about what the newspaper says, about what the internet says, and look for the actual truth. Not what the truth we want to believe, but just actual factual statements. Because as you can see here, the propaganda, it's everywhere. The worst part is the propaganda doesn't even know it's propaganda. I'm sure when they wrote this story, they thought it was like a legitimate news, like it was really important, like this is actually objective. And the fact of the matter is, I already showed you all the parts of the story that prove, without a doubt, that under Associated Press standards, it's absolute advocacy work. But you got to do that. Because, the media, as much as we hate them, they've got the power. They frame reality. They unfortunately end up writing history. And if you don't go in there and challenge them and question them and contest what they say and the narratives they address and the view of the world they want to disseminate, bad things happen. And, if these guys are going to be the fourth estate, then we the people got to be the fifth estate. And, if you like this video, let me know. I might do a couple more. And just be a critical consumer of media, because, really, the future's counting on that.